in the heart of the Arizona Territory, where silence was a commodity, and the sun bleached secrets from bone, a man's life was slipping away in plain sight. He was Hastine Yazzie, a Navajo elder, whose wealth was measured in land livestock and the silver that bore his intricate mark. Every powerful man in the territory, from cattle barons to government agents, knew his name. Yet as a strange sickness coiled around his spirit, they saw only an old man succumbing to the harshness of the desert. They all missed the clues, all except for one person, a girl so quiet most folks barely knew she existed. This is the story of how the shyest girl in Dust Devil Gulch noticed the symptoms everyone ignored, and in doing so unraveled a conspiracy of greed and poison that nearly claimed one of the West's great men. The Red Mesa trading post was less a building and more a scar on the face of the desert. It squatted under the vast, indifferent blue of the Arizona sky, its adobe walls the color of dried blood, its windows squinting against the relentless glare. Dust fine as powdered bone settled on everything, the warped porch planks, the stacked sacks of flour and beans, and the soul of Sarah Jane Miller. At 17, Sarah Jane was as much a fixture of the post as the pickle barrel or the scent of cured leather and chewing tobacco. She was an orphan, taken in by the proprietor, old Mr. Abernathy, after her parents' wagon broke an axle, and their subsequent fever broke them. Abernathy wasn't cruel, but he was a man of commerce, and he saw in Sarah Jane a pair of quiet hands that required no pay beyond a cot in the storeroom and 3 meals a day. She moved through the world like a whisper. Her hair, the color of sun-bleached prairie grass, was always tied back in a severe bun. Her calico dress was faded from 1,000 washings. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then her voice was a low murmur, as if afraid to disturb the air. This quietness was her shield. People's eyes slid right over her. She was the girl who swept the floors, stocked the shelves, and scrubbed the pots a ghost in the bustling ecosystem of the trading post. But while her voice was silent, her eyes were not. Sarah Jane was a watcher. She saw the desperation in a homesteader's wife as she debated buying medicine over flour. She saw the flick of a card sharp's wrist as he dealt a hand to a weary cowboy. And she saw the quiet dignity of the Navajo who came to trade. Among them, Hastine Yazzie was a king. He wasn't loud or boastful, like the cattle baron Jedediah Kane, who stormed into the post with his spurs jingling like a warning. Yazzie arrived with the quiet authority of a mountain. He was a man of perhaps 60 winters, with a face like a magnificent canyon, carved by sun and wisdom. His hair, streaked with silver, was tied in a traditional tsiyale. He wore fine turquoise and silver jewelry of his own, making each piece a story. His wealth was legendary, derived from vast herds of sheep that painted the distant mesas white, and from the silver he coaxed from the earth and shaped into beauty. When Hastine Yazzie spoke, even the boisterous Jedediah Kane would quiet down. Mr. Abernathy would scurry from behind the counter, his usual gruffness replaced by an oily deference. Yazzie's trade was the lifeblood of the post. It was on a blistering Tuesday in August that Sarah Jane first noticed something was wrong. Yazzie was at the counter, negotiating a price for a shipment of wool with Abernathy. It was a ritual she had seen dozens of times. Yazzie would stand straight and still, his gaze unwavering. Abernathy would bluster and gesture. This time it was different. As Yazzie reached out to sign the ledger, Sarah Jane, who was refilling a bin of pinto beans nearby, saw it a tremor in his hand. It was almost imperceptible, a faint, rhythmic flutter in the powerful fingers that could bend silver and shear a sheep with surgical precision. He paused, pressed his hand flat on the counter for a second, as if to still it, then signed his name. The signature, usually a strong, fluid mark, was subtly jagged. Mr. Abernathy didn't see it. He was too busy counting the imaginary money in his head. Later that afternoon, Yazzie sat at one of the small tables, sipping the strong black coffee Sarah Jane had brewed. His son, Cale, a proud young man with his father's sharp eyes, but not his patience, stood beside him. Sarah Jane brought over a fresh pot. "More coffee, Mr. Yazzie," she murmured, her eyes on the floor. "Ah," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Yes, child. Thank you." As she poured, she noticed his gaze. It was usually as sharp and focused as a hawk's. Today it was distant. He was looking at the far wall, but his eyes seemed to be seeing through it, lost in some middle distance. He blinked slowly like a man waking from a deep sleep. Kyle placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Father, are you tired?" Yazzie shook his head, a gesture that seemed to take a monumental effort. "The sun is strong today. It saps a man's strength." But Sarah Jane had seen him work all day, under a sun twice as fierce, without so much as breaking a sweat. This was not fatigue. This was something else, a subtle fraying at the edges of a great man. She took the empty cups and retreated to the kitchen, the image of that slight tremor, that vacant stare imprinted on her mind. It was a discord in the familiar music of the trading post, a single note played wrong that only she, the silent listener, seemed to hear. Over the next few days, the dissonant notes grew more frequent. She saw him stumble slightly as he stepped off the porch, an uncharacteristic clumsiness for a man who moved with the grace of a desert cat. He would sometimes pause mid-sentence, losing his train of thought for a moment, before Kyle would gently prompt him. Once Jedediah Kane was at the post, his loud voice filling the room as he boasted about a new parcel of land he'd acquired near the San Juan River land that bordered Yazzie's grazing territory. "Gotta be aggressive to get ahead in this country," Abernathy Kane boomed, slapping the counter. "The meek ain't gonna inherit nothing but a 6-foot plot of dirt." His eyes flickered towards Yazzie. It was a look of predatory challenge. Hastine Yazzie met his gaze, but the fire in his eyes, usually a burning coal, seemed banked, covered in a fine layer of ash. He gave a slow, tired nod and said nothing. The old Yazzie would have countered with a proverb, a quiet but sharp retort that would have silenced the blustering cattleman. The silence was more alarming than any argument. Sarah Jane, wiping down a nearby table, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Something was profoundly wrong. The giant was faltering, and the wolves were watching. Everyone else saw an old Navajo man, perhaps tired from a long journey, perhaps feeling his age. But Sarah Jane, the girl who saw everything, because she was herself unseen, saw a man being erased before their very eyes. The sickness, or whatever it was, took root quickly. Within a week, the changes in Hastine Yazzie were no longer subtle. The tremor in his hand was now a constant, visible shaking. He began moving with a shuffling gait, his feet dragging in the dust, as if they were weighted with lead. His disorientation grew more pronounced. One morning he asked Walter Finch, the post's prim and tidy clerk, the same question about a shipment of silver conchos 3 times in the span of 10 minutes, with no memory of having asked it before. Walter, a man whose thin smile never quite reached his eyes, answered patiently each time. "It's all taken care of, Mr. Yazzie. The freight is scheduled for Friday." He would then glance at Cale with a look of practiced pity. Kyle's pride was turning to raw-edged fear. He hovered over his father, his face a mask of confusion and worry. He attributed it to a spiritual malaise, a disharmony with the world, and had sent for a hatawi, a medicine man from their home near Canyon de Chelly. But that was days away. Sarah Jane couldn't bear it. Her quiet observations had coalesced into a terrifying certainty. This wasn't age. This wasn't a spiritual sickness. This was something physical, something aggressive and fast. She had to speak up. Gathering every scrap of courage she possessed, she approached Mr. Abernathy as he was locking the cash box for the night. The room was empty, save for the two of them, the lamps casting long dancing shadows. "Mr. Abernathy, sir," she began, her voice barely a squeak. He grunted without looking up. "What is it, girl? I'm busy." "It's about Mr. Yazzie." This got his attention. He snapped the box shut and turned his eyes narrowing. "What about him?" "Sir, he's very ill. I think he needs a doctor, not just a medicine man. A real doctor." Abernathy let out a short, harsh laugh. "A doctor, girl? Have you seen Doc Brody lately? He's more likely to prescribe a bottle of whiskey for himself than to diagnose anything. Besides, the Navajo have their ways. Kyle is handling it. It's not our place to interfere." "But sir, it's getting worse so fast." She pressed her heart, hammering against her ribs. "The shaking, the confusion. It's not normal. I saw him today try to drink from an empty cup." Abernathy's face hardened. "Sarah Jane, let me give you some advice. You are here to work, not to meddle. Hastine Yazzie is the most important client this post has. The last thing I need is you, a penniless orphan, bothering his family with hysterical notions. Do you understand me? You keep your head down, your mouth shut, and you do your job. Now get to sweeping." The dismissal was as sharp as a slap. Humiliation and fear warred within her. She retreated, broom in hand, feeling smaller and more invisible than ever. Her concerns, so real and urgent to her, were nothing but the hysterical notions of a nobody. But she couldn't let it go. The image of Yazzie's vacant eyes haunted her. Ignoring Abernathy's warning, she decided to seek out the one person who was supposed to help the town doctor. Doc Brody's office was a small, dusty, clapboard building at the far end of Dust Devil Gulch's main street. It smelled of stale whiskey, carbolic acid, and defeat. She found him slumped over his desk, a half-empty bottle his only companion. He was a man whose skills had long ago been pickled in alcohol. "Doc Brody," she whispered from the doorway. He lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. What is it? Can't you see I'm consulting my medical texts?" He gestured vaguely at the bottle. "It's about Hastine Yazzie. He's at the trading post. He's very sick." She quickly listed the symptoms: the tremors, the memory loss, the stumbling, the rapid decline. She spoke with an urgency that for a moment seemed to penetrate his alcoholic fog. He squinted, trying to place the name. "Yazzie, the rich Indian. Right. And you say he's shaking, confused." He gave a wet chuckle. "Girl, the man's got to be 60, maybe 70 years old. It's called getting old. The body breaks down. The mind follows. Happens to everyone. Now, unless you've got a silver dollar for my time, I suggest you go back to whatever it is you do." He waved a dismissive hand and reached for his bottle. The consultation was over. Sarah Jane walked back to the trading post, under a canopy of mocking stars, a cold despair settling over her. She was utterly alone in her conviction. The two men of authority in the town had brushed her off as if she were a bothersome fly. She was trapped by her station in life, a shy, powerless girl whose voice carried no weight. As she neared the post, she saw two figures standing in the deep shadows of the livery stable, Jedediah Kane and the clerk Walter Finch. It was an odd pairing. Kane, the bombastic cattle baron, and Finch, the quiet, meticulous man of numbers. She instinctively shrank back behind a stack of barrels, her habit of going unnoticed serving her well. She couldn't hear their words, only the low rumble of Kane's voice and the sibilant hiss of Finch's replies. But she saw Kane pass a small, heavy-looking pouch to Finch, who quickly pocketed it. Then Kane clapped Finch hard on the shoulder, a gesture that was less friendly and more possessive. A moment later, they separated, melting back into the darkness. It was strange. Finch was a clerk on a modest salary. What business could he have with a man like Jedediah Kane, a man known for buying loyalty and breaking those who crossed him? The image of the secret exchange, combined with her fears for Yazzie, planted a new seed of unease in her mind. It was another discordant note, another piece that didn't fit, and it made the hair on her arms stand on end. The sickness wasn't the only thing wrong at the Red Mesa trading post. Something rotten was festering in the shadows. The Hattawai arrived 2 days later, a wizened man with eyes that seemed to hold the memory of the desert itself. For a full day and night, the trading post was filled with the sound of rhythmic chanting, and the sacred rattle, the air thick with the scent of burning cedar and sage. Sarah Jane watched from a distance as the medicine man performed the blessing way ceremony in the small room Abernathy had given Yazzie. She saw Kyle's desperate hope, the fervent belief that these ancient rites would restore the harmony in his father's body and spirit. But the chants faded, and the sacred smoke cleared, and Hastin Yazzie was no better. If anything, he was worse. He now lay listless on his cot, rarely speaking, his eyes clouded over with a profound confusion. He did not recognize his own son for a full hour that morning. Kyle's hope curdled into a grief so sharp it was painful to witness. He emerged from the room, his shoulders slumped, the proud warrior, reduced to a lost boy. He walked out onto the porch and stared at the distant, unyielding mesas, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. This was her chance, her last chance. Every ounce of her being screamed at her to stay silent, to mind her place, but the image of Yazzie's failing light was stronger than her fear. She took a steadying breath, wiped her damp palms on her apron, and stepped out onto the porch. "Mr. Yazzie." Kyle turned, his eyes filled with a raw, defensive anger. "My name is Cale. What do you want?" I'm Sarah Jane. I work here," she stammered, intimidated by the force of his grief. "I'm so sorry about your father. The white man's pity is worth less than the dust on my boots," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "The ceremony, it did not work. The sickness is too deep." "That's what I need to talk to you about," she pressed on her voice, gaining a sliver of strength. "I don't believe it's a spiritual sickness, not in the way you think. I believe he's ill, physically ill. I think someone needs to take him to a real hospital, maybe in Prescott. The doctor here is no good." Kyle stared at her, his disbelief warring with his desperation. A white doctor. "After your people have taken our land, killed the buffalo, and tried to poison our spirits, you think I will now hand my father, Hastin Yazzie, over to them to be bled and cut and experimented on? No, I've been watching him," she said, her words tumbling out now. It started with a tremor in his hand. Then he got confused. He stumbles. He forgets things. This is happening too fast for it to be old age. It's like a candle being snuffed out. Something is causing it. His expression hardened. The wall of pride, the deep-seated mistrust between their peoples, slammed down between them. He saw not a concerned observer, but a pale, stammering white girl, an employee of the very traders who often cheated his people, offering foolish, insulting advice. "You have been watching him," he scoffed, his lip curling. "You sweep the floors. You know nothing of my father. You know nothing of our ways. My father is a great man. His spirit is strong, but it has been thrown out of balance. What would you know of such things?" "I know what I see," she pleaded, holding his gaze. "Please just listen. Has he eaten anything different? Drank anything new? He has eaten the food here. He has drunk the coffee, the same as everyone." Kyle snapped, his patience gone. "Go back to your chores, girl. My family's affairs are not your concern. We do not need your help." He turned his back on her, a final, unbreachable dismissal. The rejection was absolute. It was more painful than Abernathy's greed or Doc Brody's drunken apathy. Cale's denial came from a place of deep hurt and cultural pride, a fortress she had no way of entering. She retreated, her cheeks burning with shame and failure. She had tried. She had spoken up, and the world had told her in no uncertain terms to be quiet. She had been foolish to think her observations mattered. She was just the shy girl, the ghost of the trading post. Defeated, she went about her work with a numb, mechanical efficiency. She tried to push the worry from her mind, to accept that she had done all she could. But as she cleaned the main room that evening, her eyes fell on the table where Yazzie had sat just a week ago. On the floor, tucked under the table leg where it had likely been kicked, was his cup. She had been so flustered that day, she had missed it when clearing the other dishes. She bent to pick it up. It was the heavy ceramic mug Abernathy reserved for important customers. As she lifted it, she noticed it wasn't empty. A small, dark residue remained at the bottom. She brought it closer, intending to take it to the wash basin. And then she smelled it. It was a faint, almost unnoticeable scent, hidden beneath the stale aroma of cold coffee. A bitter, nutty smell, almost like almonds but wilder, earthier. Her blood ran cold. She froze, the cup trembling in her hand. The scent unlocked a memory, a ghost from her own past. Her mother before the fever had been a woman of the earth. She wasn't a doctor, but she knew plants. She knew which ones healed and which ones harmed. She had taught Sarah Jane, pointing out roots and flowers on their journey west. And she remembered her mother holding up a gnarled pale root, its leaves a deceptively vibrant green. "This one, Sarah Jane," her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "You never touch this. The old prospectors call it coyote's bane. A tiny piece can make a man's hands shake. A little more, and his mind gets cloudy like a morning fog. More than that, it stills the heart. And it has a smell, child. A smell like bitter, wild almonds." Sarah Jane stared at the dregs in the cup, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It wasn't a sickness. It wasn't old age. It wasn't a spiritual imbalance. Kyle was wrong. Doc Brody was wrong. Abernathy was wrong. It was poison. Hastine Yazzie was being murdered, slowly, cup by cup, right under their noses. And she was the only one who knew it. The weight of that knowledge, that terrible secret certainty, was heavier than any load she had ever been asked to carry. The discovery changed everything. The fear that had paralyzed Sarah Jane was burned away by a cold, clarifying anger. This was no longer a matter of a mysterious illness. It was a deliberate, malicious act. Her shyness, her instinct to retreat and remain unseen, was now a weapon. They didn't notice her. Good. She would use their ignorance to her advantage. She would watch. Her world, once the broad, dusty expanse of the trading post, shrank to a single burning point of focus, who was poisoning Hastine Yazzie. Every interaction, every gesture became a clue. She moved through her chores with a new purpose, her eyes missing nothing. She watched the gruff freighter, Silas, who always complained about the Navajo. She watched the cowboys who worked for Jedediah Kane, their casual cruelty and swaggering arrogance, making them easy suspects. She even watched Mr. Abernathy, wondering if his greed was deep enough to contemplate murder for the sake of Yazzy's vast estate. But her suspicion kept circling back to one person, Walter Finch, the clerk. On the surface, Walter was the least likely suspect. He was meticulous, polite, and efficient. His ledgers were perfectly balanced, his clothes impeccably clean, despite the pervasive dust. He spoke in a calm, measured tone, and always had a sympathetic word for customers. He was the picture of harmless bureaucracy. But Sarah Jane had seen him with Cain, and now, watching him through the lens of her terrible new knowledge, she saw things she'd previously overlooked. She noticed that Walter was always the one who prepared Hastine Yazzy's coffee. It had become a small ritual. While Sarah Jane brewed the large pot for everyone, Walter would take a cup and say, "Let me get this for Mr. Yazzie. I'll add a little extra honey just the way he likes it." He would turn his back for a moment at the small provisions counter where the sugar, honey, and spices were kept, and then deliver the cup personally. It had seemed like a gesture of kindness, of good service. Now it looked sinister. She observed him around Yazzy's son, Cale. Walter was a font of sympathy. "I'm so sorry for what you and your father are going through. Kyle," he'd say, his face a mask of concern. "It's a terrible thing to see such a strong man laid so low." He was an expert at mimicking the emotions he believed others wanted to see. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place during a tense visit from Jedediah Cain. The cattle baron strode into the post ostensibly to buy a new rope, but his real purpose was clear. He walked over to Cale, who was sitting vigil by his father's door. "Heard your father's not doing so well." Cain said, his voice a low, insincere rumble. "Real shame. He's got a lot of prime grazing land up by the Black Creek, land that needs active management. My offer to buy that parcel still stands. Might take a burden off your shoulders in this difficult time." Kyle, his face tight with anger, rose to his feet. "My father's land is not for sale. Not now, not ever." Cain just smiled, a cold, predatory gleam in his eyes. "Things change, boy. Keep my offer in mind." As Cain turned to leave, his eyes met Walter Finch's across the room. It was for less than a second, a fleeting glance, but Sarah Jane saw it all. In that look, she saw a question from Cain. "Is it done yet?" and an answer from Walter almost. It was a moment of silent, chilling conspiracy. The clerk and the cattle baron, the snake in the grass and the vulture circling overhead. Cain wanted the land. Yazzie would never sell, but if Yazzie died, his son, distraught and inexperienced, might be pressured into a quick sale to settle his father's affairs. It was a plot as old and as cruel as the desert itself. Walter in debt or in league with Cain for a share of the profits was the instrument. The weapon was a bitter root administered in a cup of coffee. She had the who, the how, and the why, but it was still just her word against theirs. Walter was trusted, Cain was powerful, and she was a nobody. Accusing them would be like a mouse roaring at a lion. They would crush her without a second thought. Mr. Abernathy would throw her out into the desert for making such a wild accusation against a trusted employee and a wealthy customer. No, an accusation wasn't enough. She needed proof. Hard, undeniable proof. She needed to catch the serpent in the act of delivering his venom. That afternoon, she watched as Walter prepared to take Yazzie his mid-afternoon coffee. The old man was now mostly bedridden, weak and unresponsive. Kyle had briefly left the post riding out to a small spring for fresh water, believing it might hold some purity the well water lacked. It was the first time Yazzie had been left without a family member by his side. Walter prepared the cup at the provisions counter as usual. This was her chance. Her mind raced fear and adrenaline, a potent cocktail in her veins. She needed a way to see what he was doing, a way to get a sample. As Walter turned his back to the main room to add his special honey. Sarah Jane, holding a heavy sack of flour, walked past him on her way to the storeroom. With a small, desperate lurch, she tripped, sending the sack crashing to the floor. It burst open, sending a huge cloud of white flour billowing into the air. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she cried out, her voice genuinely frantic. The room was instantly chaotic. The flour cloud enveloped the counter, causing Walter to cough and curse as he was covered in the fine white powder. "You clumsy girl," Abernathy yelled from the front of the store. "Look at this mess." But Sarah Jane wasn't looking at the mess. In that single chaotic moment, her eyes were locked on Walter's hands. As he flinched from the flour cloud, his right hand, which had been hovering over the coffee cup, jerked back. From his sleeve, a tiny, intricately stitched leather pouch fell onto the counter, spilling a small amount of a greyish-brown powder next to the coffee cup. It was no bigger than a thumbnail. Walter, blinded and choking, didn't see it. He was too busy wiping the flour from his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Finch," Sarah Jane said, rushing forward with a rag, her heart threatening to beat its way out of her chest. "Let me help you clean up." In one swift, fluid motion, as she wiped the flour from the counter, she swept the tiny pouch and the spilled powder into her palm with the rag. She closed her hand into a tight fist, the damning evidence hidden within. "Just get a broom and clean this disaster up," Walter snapped, his composure finally cracking. He brushed himself off, grabbed the now poisoned cup of coffee, and after a moment's hesitation, carried it towards Yazzy's room. He had to complete the act. To do otherwise would look suspicious. Sarah Jane fled to the back of the storeroom, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She opened her palm. There it was, the small leather pouch and a pinch of the deadly powder. She brought it to her nose. The smell was unmistakable. Bitter, wild almonds, the scent of coyote's bane, the scent of murder. She had her proof. The proof in her hand was both a shield and a target. It could save Hastin Yazzie, but if discovered, it would surely mean her own death. Kane and Walter would not hesitate to silence her permanently. She couldn't go to Abernathy. She couldn't go to the town's useless sheriff, a man firmly in Jedediah Kane's pocket. She had only one possible ally, Kyle. But he had already dismissed her once. She had to make him believe. She wrapped the pouch and the powder carefully in a small piece of cloth and tucked it deep into her apron pocket. Her plan formed out of sheer desperation. Walter had already delivered one dose of poison. He wouldn't try again until the next day. She had until morning. Kyle returned with the fresh water, his face etched with disappointment that his father's condition had not miraculously improved. Sarah Jane waited for a moment when he was alone, standing by the corral and staring out at the setting sun. She approached him, not as a timid girl, but as someone bearing a terrible burden. "Cale," she said, her voice low but steady. There was no Mr. this time. This was too urgent for formalities. He turned annoyed. "I told you. You told me to leave you alone." She interrupted, a boldness she didn't know she possessed rising to the surface. "And I will. But first you need to look at this. And you need to listen. Not with your pride, but with your ears. Your father's life depends on it." The raw conviction in her voice stopped his angry retort. She carefully unwrapped the cloth, revealing the small pouch and the powder. "I know what's making your father sick," she said softly. "It's this, coyote's bane. It's a poison. A little bit makes you shake. More makes you confused. Enough stops your heart. Someone has been putting it in his coffee every day." Kyle stared at the pouch, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, disbelief, anger, and a dawning, terrible flicker of fear. "Where did you get this? From the man who is poisoning him. Walter Finch, the clerk." Finch, Kyle scoffed, though the sound was hollow. The quiet one. Why would he do such a thing? For Jedediah Kane, Sarah Jane explained, the pieces tumbling out. Kane wants your father's land. He knows your father would never sell. But if your father dies, he thinks he can pressure you. I saw Kane pay Walter 2 nights ago, and I saw Walter put this powder in your father's coffee not an hour ago. I created a diversion and got this when he dropped it. She told him everything, the tremor she'd noticed first. The vacant stares, Doc Brody's dismissal, the secret meeting, and the final damning evidence now resting in her palm. She spoke clearly and concisely, the details sharp and undeniable. Kyle looked from the pouch to her face, searching her eyes. He saw no hysteria, no foolishness. He saw only a terrifying certainty. The puzzle pieces she laid out fit together with a horrible, sickening click, explaining his father's unnaturally rapid decline in a way that spiritual imbalance never could. His own observations, his father's distaste for the coffee he usually loved, the way his symptoms always worsened in the afternoon, came rushing back. If this is true, he whispered, the implication crashing down on him. He's dying, Kyle, she said, her voice breaking for the first time. And they're all just watching it happen. A warrior's resolve solidified in Kyle's eyes, replacing his grief. His mistrust of her, a white girl, was eclipsed by the evidence, and the burning need to protect his father. What do we do? We can't just accuse them, she said, thinking fast. The sheriff works for Kane. It's your word and mine against theirs. They'll call us liars. We have to catch him. We need a witness besides me. A witness they can't dismiss. Abernathy, Kyle said. He is a greedy man, but he is not a killer. He fears Kane, but he respects my father's business. If he sees it with his own eyes, he cannot deny it. And so the trap was set. The next morning, the routine began as usual. Sarah Jane brewed the large pot of coffee. Kyle stayed by his father's side, feigning exhaustion and despair. The stage was empty. Around 10 o'clock, Walter Finch picked up a clean cup. "I'll take some coffee into Mr. Yazzie," he announced to Abernathy. As Walter turned to the provisions counter, Kyle stepped out of his father's room. "Mr. Abernathy," he called out, his voice loud enough to carry through the store. "I need to speak with you about settling my father's account. I fear he will not last much longer. Perhaps we should discuss it in your office." It was the perfect bait. The mention of settling the large and profitable account was irresistible to Abernathy. "Of course, son, of course," he said, bustling over. The path to his office led directly past the provisions counter where Walter was preparing the cup. This was the moment Sarah Jane had orchestrated. "Walter, bring us 2 cups of coffee in the office as well, would you?" Abernathy commanded as he walked past. Sarah Jane, who had been sweeping near the back, watched, her breath held tight in her chest. Walter's back was to them. He likely assumed no one was paying him any mind. He reached for the honey, then his hand dipped furtively into his waistcoat pocket. He pulled out another small pouch, he must have had more than one, and quickly shook a small amount of the greyish powder into the cup intended for Hosteen Yazzie. But Kyle had, accidentally, dropped a small silver button on the floor. As Abernathy passed, Kyle stopped him. "Sir, look, your button." The move forced Abernathy to stop and turn just for a second. It was a second perfectly timed. His gaze fell upon the provisions counter at the exact moment Walter was tipping the poison into the cup. Abernathy froze. His eyes widened first in confusion, then in utter disbelief, and finally in horrified understanding. He saw the surreptitious movement, the powder, the way Walter quickly pocketed the pouch. He looked at the cup Walter was holding, then at the door to Yazzie's room. The color drained from his face. Walter, oblivious, finished preparing the cups. He turned around, a polite smile fixed on his face. "The coffee for Mr. Yazzie, and 2 for you, gentlemen." He stopped dead. The smile evaporated. He was looking at the faces of Cale and Abernathy. Cale's face was a mask of cold, murderous rage. Abernathy's was a portrait of slack-jawed horror. And in that deafening silence, Walter knew. He had been seen. The trap had been sprung. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The only sound was the buzzing of a fly against a dusty window pane. Walter Finch's face, usually a placid mask of polite indifference, crumbled into a rictus of pure panic. He looked from Abernathy's horrified expression to Kyle's simmering fury, and he saw his own doom reflected in their eyes. The coffee cup in his hand, the instrument of his crime, trembled. His instinct for self-preservation, honed by years of quiet deception, took over. He wasn't a fighter. He was a cornered rat, and he did what cornered rats do. He lunged, but he didn't lunge for the door. He lunged for the closest, weakest shield he could find Sarah Jane. She was still standing by the storeroom door broom, in hand, a silent witness to the drama she had set in motion. Before she could react, Walter crossed the room in 3 desperate strides. He dropped the cups which shattered on the floorboards, splashing poisonous coffee across the wood. He grabbed Sarah Jane, pulling her in front of him, and yanking a small skinning knife from his belt. He pressed the blade to her throat. "Nobody move!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with terror. "Nobody move, or the girl dies!" Sarah Jane gasped, the cold steel a line of ice against her skin. The smell of Walter's sweat and fear was suffocating. Abernathy let out a strangled cry. "Walter! For God's sake, man! What are you doing?" "Shut up, old man!" Walter spat his eyes wild. "You saw nothing. None of you saw anything." Cale took a step forward, his hands clenched, a low growl building in his chest. "Let her go, Finch." "Stay back," Walter screamed, pressing the knife harder against Sarah Jane's throat. A thin red line appeared on her skin. "I mean it. I'll kill her. I just need to get to my horse." He started dragging Sarah Jane backward, his body shielding him as he moved toward the front entrance. The post, which moments before had been a stage for a quiet drama, was now a hostage scene. A couple of prospectors who had been examining pics at the far end of the store were now frozen in place, their eyes wide with shock. Sarah Jane's mind was a whirlwind of terror. She could feel the slight tremor in Walter's hand, the panicked thumping of his heart against her back. This was it. This was how her story ended, as a footnote in a failed plot, silenced by the very man she had exposed. But then something inside her shifted. The same well of desperate courage that had driven her to speak to Cale, to set this trap, surged through her again. She had not come this far to die silently. "He did it for Jedediah Kane," she said, her voice surprisingly loud and clear, though it trembled. Walter flinched as if struck. "Be quiet. Kane paid him to poison Hastine Yazzie." She continued, her voice ringing with conviction, projecting to everyone in the store. "He wants the land. Walter Finch is a murderer for hire." Each word was a blow to Walter's crumbling composure. He was no longer a quiet clerk. He was a venomous killer, and she was making sure everyone knew it. Her words had another effect. They broke the spell of inaction. As Walter was momentarily distracted by her accusations, Kyle moved. He didn't charge forward. Instead, he grabbed the nearest weapon he could find, a heavy cast-iron skillet from a stack by the stove. With a warrior's cry, he hurled it not at Walter, but at the shelf of canned goods right beside him. The heavy skillet hit the shelf with a deafening crash. A cascade of tinned peaches, beans, and tomatoes rained down around Walter, startling him and forcing him to instinctively shield his head. His grip on Sarah Jane loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening she needed. Sarah Jane stomped down hard with the heel of her boot on Walter's instep. He yelped in pain. In the same motion, she drove her elbow backward, jamming it into his ribs with all her might. The breath whooshed out of him, and his arm flew wide. She broke free, scrambling away from him, as Cale charged forward. The fight was short and brutal. Walter, armed only with a small knife, was no match for the enraged Navajo warrior. Kyle moved with a speed and ferocity that was breathtaking. He deflected the knife thrust, seized Walter's wrist, and with a sickening crack broke it. Walter screamed and dropped the knife. Kyle subdued him with a few swift, precise blows, leaving the clerk a whimpering, broken heap on the dusty floorboards. Silence descended once more, broken only by Walter's pathetic sobs. Abernathy, pale and shaking, finally found his voice. "Get the sheriff," he croaked to one of the stunned prospectors. "The sheriff is on Kane's payroll," Kyle said, breathing heavily as he stood over the vanquished Finch. "We will handle this. We will take him to the fort in Prescott. The army will listen." He then turned to Sarah Jane, who was leaning against the counter, her throat bleeding slightly, her body trembling with the aftershock of the fight. He walked to her, and his face, which had been so full of anger and suspicion, was now filled with a profound, humbling gratitude. "You saved his life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You the quiet girl. You heard what no one else would listen to." He gently touched her arm. "Your courage is greater than that of any warrior I have known." At that moment, from the back room, a weak voice called out, "Cale!" It was Hastine Yazzie. Roused by the commotion, he had fought his way through the poisonous fog in his mind. Kyle rushed to his side. Sarah Jane followed, her own pain forgotten. Yazzie was sitting up, his eyes clearer than they had been in weeks. He looked at his son, then at Sarah Jane. The coffee," he rasped. Something was wrong with the coffee. He had been fighting it all along. His spirit, as Cale had said, was strong. "It was poison, father," Cale said softly. "But it's over now. You are safe." Sarah Jane knew it wasn't quite over. The poison was still in his system, but now they knew what they were fighting. "The antidote," she said suddenly, the memory of her mother's lessons surfacing once more. "My mother said there was a plant, thistle root, boiled in milk. It doesn't cure it, but it helps the body fight the poison. It cleanses the blood." Kyle looked at her, his trust in her now absolute. "Show me," he said. The reckoning at Red Mesa was over. The plot was exposed, the poisoner caught. But the true battle, the fight to bring Hastine Yazzie back from the brink of death, had just begun. And its general was the invisible girl who had finally found her voice. The days that followed were a crucible. With Walter Finch tied up in the storeroom, awaiting a wagon to Fort Prescott, and the justice of the U.S. Marshals, the focus of the Red Mesa trading post shifted from commerce to healing. Guided by Sarah Jane's remembered knowledge, Kyle and a few trusted Navajo who had arrived from Yazzie's homestead scoured the nearby canyons for the specific thistle her mother had described. They brought it back, and Sarah Jane, her hands surprisingly steady, prepared the antidote. She boiled the fibrous root in goat's milk until it created a thick, bitter tea. Getting Hastine Yazzie to drink it was the first challenge. He was weak, drifting in and out of a delirious state where shadows held terrors and familiar faces were strangers. But Kyle and Sarah Jane worked together, a new and powerful alliance. Kyle would speak to his father in Diné, his voice a soothing, constant presence, while Sarah Jane would gently spoon the life-saving liquid past his lips. Mr. Abernathy, shaken to his core and deeply ashamed of his own willful ignorance, did what he did best. He provided resources. He gave them unfettered access to his stores, blankets, clean water, any food they required. His deference to Sarah Jane was now absolute. He no longer saw a charity case. He saw the woman who had saved his business from becoming a murder scene and had prevented the death of his most valued client. The news of what had happened spread like a brush fire. Sheriff Miller, a portly man with a perpetual sheen of sweat on his brow, rode out from Dust Devil Gulch, his face a mask of blustering authority. He made a show of questioning the blubbering Walter Finch. "This is a serious accusation against Mr. Kane," the sheriff declared, avoiding everyone's eyes. "A respected citizen." Kyle stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his own knife. "This man confessed. The girl has the proof. Jedediah Kane is a snake, and you are his charmer. Take Finch to the fort, or we will." Faced with Kyle's unyielding anger and the silent testimony of a dozen witnesses, the sheriff had no choice. He hauled Finch away, knowing the story would not be contained. Indeed, Jedediah Kane, hearing of the plot's failure, did not wait for justice to come to him. He vanished. By the time the marshals arrived, his ranch was deserted, his cattle scattered. He had fled a coward stripped of his power, his name now a curse in the territory. Meanwhile, inside the trading post, a miracle was slowly unfolding. The thistle root tea, combined with the tireless care and the powerful ceremonies once again performed by the Hatawi, began to work. Color returned to Hastin Yazi's face. The tremors in his hands lessened. The fog of confusion began to recede like a morning mist burning off in the desert sun. One afternoon, a week after the confrontation, Sarah Jane was sitting by his cot, changing a cool compress on his forehead. He had been sleeping peacefully. His eyes opened. This time they were fully present. They were the clear, sharp eyes of the man she remembered. He looked at her, not as a child or a servant, but as an equal. "They call you Sarah Jane," he said, his voice raspy but firm. She nodded, unable to speak. "My son told me what you did," Yazi continued. "You stood against the wind. You saw the serpent in the shadows. There is no word in your language for the honor you have shown my family." He reached out his hand, still weak, and placed it over hers. "In our tongue, we have a name for a person with your gift. Dien, Iniwiji, the one who listens with a sacred ear. You do not just hear noise, you hear the truth beneath it." Tears streamed down Sarah Jane's face, washing away years of silence and invisibility. To be seen, truly seen by this great man, was a more powerful balm than any praise she could have imagined. Hastin Yazi's recovery was long, but it was complete. When he was finally strong enough to ride, the day of his departure was an event. His family had gathered their magnificent horses and wagons, filling the area around the post. Before leaving, Yazi, flanked by Kale, approached Sarah Jane on the porch. He was no longer a patient, but a king restored to his throne. From a velvet pouch, he produced a necklace. It was a stunning piece of silverwork, intricate and heavy, with a large, perfect turquoise stone at its center, the color of the sky after a cleansing rain. "This is for you," he said, placing it around her neck. A reminder that the quietest voice can speak the greatest truth. The Red Mesa is your home for as long as you wish it. But if you ever seek a new home, my people will call you daughter. Kyle stepped forward and bowed his head slightly to her. "Thank you, Sarah Jane Miller. You taught me that wisdom does not always carry a loud voice or a warrior's frame." As they rode away, kicking up the red dust that gave the mesa its name, Sarah Jane stood on the porch, her hand on the cool, smooth stone of the necklace. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. Mr. Abernathy came and stood beside her for once, completely silent. She was no longer Sarah Jane Miller, the shy orphan girl. She was Dien Iniwi, the woman who listens. She had found her voice, not by learning how to shout, but by trusting the power of her own quiet observation. And in the vast, harsh, and beautiful landscape of the American West, she had carved out a place for herself, not with a gun or a claim stake, but with courage, a keen eye, and a heart that refused to let the truth go unheard. The story of Sarah Jane Miller and Hastine Yazzie is more than just a tale of poison and plots in the Old West. It's a powerful reminder that heroes aren't always the ones with the loudest voices or the quickest draw. Sometimes, true courage is found in the quiet observer, the person who pays attention when no one else will, who listens to the subtle warnings the world provides. Sarah Jane's journey from an invisible orphan to a respected hero teaches us that your station in life doesn't define your worth, and that speaking a difficult truth, even when your voice shakes, can change the world. If this story of quiet courage and unlikely heroism moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates tales of the real West, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring history to life. Your support helps us continue to tell these incredible tales. Thank you for listening.